numerous people from a variety of backgrounds and demographics to develop and execute impactful initiatives. For the last 4 years, James has served at a Fort Worth-based community bank as a senior compliance officer, where he works closely with the bank's business partners, providing insight into the regulatory and legal requirements affecting their daily activities and ensuring adequate controls are in place to mitigate compliance risks. A native Texan, James was raised in the southern sector of Dallas and attended Charles Rice Elementary and Atwell Middle School, as well as several others. Thank you very much, James, for being here. Now I'm going to welcome Mike and Laura to share their presentation on zoning.
So I'm Laura, and this is Mike. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the current and equitable pattern of industrial zoning adjacent to neighborhoods of color in the city of Dallas. We're going to discuss the history of how the city enacted this zoning and some of our cases on how to remedy it. There are two City of Dallas industrial zoning categories that allow for heavy industrial uses. Those are industrial manufacturing and industrial research. The city's two categories of industrial zoning are specifically prohibited from being next to homes by the zoning code. The city zoning code prohibits use of industrial manufacturing zoning in or near areas of residential development. The city zoning code also prohibits the use of industrial research zoning in areas of low and medium density residential development. Even though it is the city's policy that is set out in the city zoning code to protect families and their homes from adjacent industrial uses, the city has consistently zoned areas for industrial uses adjacent to single-family homes in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Here's the example of Choppy with the adjacent industrial plants. This is a current map of industrial zoning by race and ethnicity of the neighborhood in a city. The red and blue crosshatch show the industrial zoning locations. It is a fact that the city's current industrial zoning disproportionately harms Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Shingle Mountain is a recent well-known example of the harmful effects of industry adjacent to residents. The city recognizes that this inequitable industrial zoning has a discriminatory effect. This is a map from the city's racial equity consultant, TVA, showing the adjacency of industrial zoning to Black and Hispanic residents. As the consultant states, the industrial zoning is noticeably absent from white neighborhoods. The city zoning is enacted by the city council. The city has intentionally zoned these industrial locations with residential adjacency. There are 49 locations of industrial zoning adjacent to single-family zoning in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, and only one in a racially mixed neighborhood. The result is a severe discriminatory effect with the city's industrial zoning categories of the industrial manufacturing and industrial research. This is a map of an area of West Dallas, and you can see the red single-family zoning line with the industrial categories adjacent to these homes. In another West Dallas example, you can see other locations of industrial zoning with residential adjacency. In some locations, there are even residents in single-family homes within the industrial zoning. These 50 maps are on our website, danielbasharalawfirm.com, at the Unequal Zoning tab. This photo shows the residents in homes next to the GAF asphalt plant. These homes are actually inside industrial zoning itself. So in addition to the industrial zoning categories in the city's code of industrial manufacturing and industrial research, the city approves other zoning with planned development districts that are often for heavy industrial uses. The zoning of planned development with industrial uses also presents a stark discriminatory effect. There are at least 70 of these planned development districts with industrial uses in Black and Hispanic areas compared to a handful in racially mixed areas in white areas. One example shown here is of the paper mill that is adjacent to the 10th Street Freedmanstown Historic District neighborhood. These 70 planned development districts with industrial uses adjacent to neighborhoods of color are in addition to the 49 Black and Hispanic neighborhoods adjacent to the city industrial categories of industrial manufacturing and industrial research. This means combined, there are over 120 Black and Hispanic neighborhoods with industrial adjacency caused by the city's intentional zoning. This is despite the city policy that such industrial zoning is not supposed to be located next to homes. The discriminatory result of this 120 industrially zoned areas next to neighborhoods is compared to white neighborhoods where industrial zoning is noticeably absent. This is an extreme discriminatory effect caused by the city's zoning. So, how did we get here? The history of the city zoning includes the city's continued use of racial zoning even after the Supreme Court declared racial zoning to be unconstitutional. So from the beginning, the city zoning was zoning done on top of racially segregated neighborhoods. In 1944, the city hired a planning firm, Harland, Bartholomew & Associates. Harland Bartholomew was an early urban planner who provided city plans for numerous cities across the country. In Dallas, his plan that the city adopted zoned the existing racially segregated neighborhoods in place. This is the Bartholomew 1944 neighborhood map for the city of Dallas with the designated Black districts highlighted by the light gray lines. The city's plan baked in place the residential racial segregation as shown by this master plan map. These 1944 city Black districts from the Bartholomew plan are overlaid here on the current industrial zoning in Dallas, and you can see the discriminatory result. This map shows the industrial manufacturing and industrial research zoning locations. Those are in red, as well as the planned development districts with industrial uses, those are in purple. The Black and Hispanic neighborhoods outlined in the 1944 master plan continue to be the same neighborhoods burdened by industrial zoning adjacencies, along with others. The yellow lines on the map show the 1944 Black districts. The orange shading on the map shows the small lot zoning the city disproportionately put in racially segregated locations. This R5A zone. I'm going to let Mike speak now.
So it's no accident. And had it been an accident, there would have been plenty of time to fix it. Okay. Had it wanted to do so, it had a perfect opportunity in the 1980s. The city had implemented a policy to re-examine zoning all over the city with an eye towards fixing industrial adjacency to residential areas. And they implemented it all over the city, except adjacent to Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. That didn't change. The industrial adjacency never changed in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. The city did not even change where the industrial zoning included residential areas. It's made those homes non-conforming uses. You're not supposed to have residential units in industrial zoning. One example is the homes that are in the industrial zoning next to GA up in West Dallas. Everyone knew then, everyone knows now. Industrial zoning hurts people living next to it. It is bad for their health. It is bad for their wealth. It freezes their investment into place where they cannot access it. They can't get loans to fix it up. They can't get loans to sell it. The effects on Black and Hispanic communities living in these places is now decades long. The environmental effects, the poverty effects, the wealth effects. Nearly 30 years ago, the federal court appointed an expert in our Dallas public housing desegregation case. The expert was to gauge the health effects on the residents of West Dallas of the zoning. She examined the hundreds of industry in West Dallas and found long-lasting and significant health effects. Her final conclusion was, it is my scientific opinion that there remains significant environmental risk to present and future residents of these areas. Nothing has changed. What can be done? We're going to highlight today some of our cases concerning industrial zoning and residential adjacency. First case is a Deepwood dump. This was a huge landfill that the city deliberately allowed to operate next to a middle-class black community south of Route 12 on Geminola Road. Now, this land was floodplain. It was zoned single family, but the city testified and admitted that their plan was to let the landfill build it up out of the floodplain, and then they were going to zone it industrial so that they get more tax revenues from it. So as soon as this neighborhood became black, this was the city's plan. Now, they didn't get to finish it because the neighbors brought the lawsuit, and the city had to stop using it, and the city had to clean it up, and that is now the Audubon Nature Center. Another case involved Cadillac Heights. This was a residential neighborhood that was ringed with heavy industrial uses. Two lead smelters, rendering plants, sewage treatment plant, and it was severely contaminated on the single-family yards with lead. The neighborhood frequently flooded because the city deliberately stopped the levees before it got to Cadillac Heights, knowing that it was going to cause the neighborhood to flood. They did not do that to similarly situated white neighborhoods. We represented the residents in 2 lawsuits. This place was beyond repair. All right, so what ended up happening was, under the pretext of a bond issue to build a police academy on top of one of the lead smelter sites, the city got a bond issue. That bond issue was passed, and there was enough money in the bond issue to give the residents the actual amount of money it took to move to viable housing in viable neighborhoods, including some in the southern Dallas suburbs. I mean, fixing it was not an option. Fixing it is an option in other places. In that case, the federal court found that there was substantial evidence to show the discriminatory and intentional discriminatory effects of the city industrial zoning. The court found, according to 1990 statistics, African Americans constituted 47.25% of the Dallas population. Living in census blocks, they're either within an industrial zone district or within 500 feet of one. Hispanics constituted 28.36% of the Dallas population living in such blocks. There wasn't room for many whites. Another example of the zoning is our case challenging the industrial zoning that Shingle Mountain was built on. The city council zoned the site heavy industrial in 2007, not 1907, 2007. The slide shows on the left side of the slide the map that the city council had in front of it showing the single-family areas adjacent to where they were zoning the heavy industrial. The zoning, the industrial zoning, was in fact, as the court found, a direct cause of shingle mound. There were other causes, and a valiant effort was made, and it was removed. The zoning is still there. In addition to dealing with the zoning, there needs to be aggressive environmental enforcement to give industry an incentive to move away from residential areas. If they can just sit there and park there and keep doing what they're doing, why go? We brought a lawsuit against some West Dallas residents against, for example, an unpermitted car junkyard in West Dallas that was in violation of environmental laws. The suit resulted in the removal of the junkyard. Another lawsuit based on environmental considerations led to shutting down a foundry in West Dallas that was adjacent to residential areas, refinery castings. Refinery castings had been emitting lead as a result of the foundry operations for decades. The city knew it, the city tested it. The city never did anything. They finally signed an agreement with refinery castings that the city would drop all its claims if refinery casting would buy some emission equipment and install it. The city dropped their claims. Refinery castings did nothing but continued to emit until we shut it down with the lawsuit. The city of Dallas industrial and residential zoning adjacency is exacerbated by another factor. And that is in this part of the country, this part of the Dallas area, the suburbs engage in massive exclusionary zoning. They exclude and prevent affordable housing for low and moderate income people, both single family and rental housing. That leaves only the affordable housing in the city of Dallas for the most part. Much of that housing is what we're seeing here. It is in areas adjacent to and influenced and affected by industrial zoning. We brought a lawsuit in several cases, one involving the town of Sunnyvale, to make them stop the exclusionary zoning, to make them stop making housing only for rich, predominantly white people. It can be done.
So you'll see, one, thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to have a chance to speak with you and share some of our work. So C-Suite Consulting is an equity, justice, and social impact firm. So our positioning in this discussion is a little bit different. We'll be talking about equitable development practices that help to address the things that we'll hear from two of our two other sets of speakers. All right, so equitable development, the plants are giving me a little green energy on the screen. That is fine. But equitable development is what we focus on. And that's really looking at a holistic community development approach that works to redress existing disparities. That's okay. Existing disparities in communities, especially focusing on the needs of historic racially discriminated against residents. The other thing that it looks at is taking development, not just once it's happened, but as it's being planned, in process, and once it's in place, to leverage those investments for the benefit of the residents who have called that place home historically. And then looking at how do they experience that place. So what other factors in their neighborhood, those social determinants of health, access to healthcare, housing, transportation, how do those impact their overall quality of life? And how is the development that's happening within their communities positively impacting the people that have called that place home? So that gives us a way to kind of center ourselves on our discussion and definition as we move forward. The important thing to note in the juxtaposition here is that the map on the left was almost 100 years ago. So we just looked at a map from 1944. This goes back a few more years. And again, we see the same patterns continuing. The important thing here, when we were looking at local level before, this was a federal enforcement. So this project was completed, the federal government said, this is where we're willing to invest. Whether that was for home loans, bank loans, any other kind of loans, or financial investment, this is what they use to regulate what they would back and what they would invest in. So of course, if the federal government tells you it's not a good investment, private industry does not follow and invest in those areas either. So you see the layers of discriminatory practices here, not necessarily local zoning, but a federal type of zoning practice. Okay. So now what we'll talk about is an approach of how different partners have come together to kind of combat some of the existing issues that we see. So this project was called Community-Driven Growth, and in the parentheses underneath, you'll see the different types of partners that we work with. So this was a community development financial institution. So think of them as a nonprofit funding partner that goes into communities that banks often won't lend to, and they provide capital. So in this process, it was an equitable development planning process. We were looking to find how we could put things into place in rapidly gentrifying areas in Dallas. And you've heard them already in the previous presentation. We're looking at South and West Dallas. This project wanted to get in early and try to find out what can we do, whether that's with zoning or partnerships, to try to help and undo some of the practices that we've seen. Okay. So on the left, you'll see an example of the results from our outreach, what we heard in that project from communities. And we use this in each one of the areas to highlight 3 categories where the communities needed additional support. One was community leadership, another one was job and wealth creation, and the third was affordable housing. We just saw the history of inequitable housing practices. So this is one of the remedies that's been put into place to try to help remedy against that. So this project started out as a $400,000 planning grant. JP Morgan Chase, like the project, invited the team to apply for an implementation grant, which always doesn't happen. So by show of hands, how many of you have participated in planning processes or seen plans completed and not implemented? Okay, so this was one of the rare times, and hopefully that policy will change and practice will change soon, where a plan was created and immediately capital was provided by an outside partner to help implement those practices. So this grant was a landmark grant of $6 million, and it works with those 4 organizations listed to help address community needs in each of those areas. So Dallas College provides job training, and they actually tailor job skills training to what the community needs. So when we were talking about before where businesses, or later in James's presentation, where businesses are locating, how there's limited access to some opportunity below 30 or in Southern Dallas, this is one of the ways to help address that. Texas Mezzanine Fund and TREC are offering funding for affordable housing. So that's to actually go into neighborhoods to create infill housing development that will meet the needs of communities and help mitigate the impacts of displacement by creating housing that's close to the price point that's already in the neighborhood. The next is Lift Fund, which is providing capital to small businesses. So businesses in the zip codes with the partner organizations from this project actually have favorable lending practices to them. So some restrictions are, I won't say completely eliminated, but there's more flexibility in lending practices. So they look at the entire applicant instead of solely focusing on credit worthiness. And that has helped increase access to capital for small businesses. When this project was completed in 2019, little did we know COVID would strike. So having this plan in place was actually a great opportunity for businesses in these areas to either get access to capital, to start a business if they were laid off, or to help stay in business during the pandemic. Okay. And the next one was a project, a 3-week project. I don't know if I'll ever do something that short again for research, but it was a research progress project with them to do a community needs survey. So what were the needs of Black residents in these areas that we've seen have been victim to discriminatory practices, that are seeing layers of those issues piled on top of their neighborhoods? What are key things that we can highlight? And so this is 2019. but we looked at health rankings, environmental justice, some of the projects that we hear or have heard about now, and then looking at a different thing with maternal morbidity. So Black women are often not heard when they go to the doctor. We're often seen as having higher pain tolerances or making things up when we're in the doctor's office. And then there's also not always access to healthcare in the places where our communities live and where they grow and thrive. So having access to that kind of care where you can build a relationship with your physician is important. And this was highlighting to them key areas where they could come back and do either programmatic investments or advocate for changes in policy, advocate for changes in zoning. And then Southern Gateway Park. This was a park foundation. So again, you kind of see it's not only on the city, there's something that we all can do, and that's my hope as you look through this, or non-traditional partners you may think about as advocates and being a part of the conversation. It doesn't only have to be the city. They are responsible for zoning, but there are things that we can do in either our professional organizations and our own individual advocacy or through collaboration that can help move changes to zoning forward. Okay? So this was another equitable development process, really looking to use the expansion of I-35 as a way to leverage investment for equitable development of the Oak Cliff community and to reconnect it after the highways in 1950s and 60s separated the community. Okay. So this is one of the examples in their report. It actually turns a year old this month, but of the ways where we looked at the solutions in the top bar, a summary of what that means and what it could include, who should be included. So tactical was looking at community activism, planning was looking more towards the city, and then policy is how can we change things either in programming or in legislation that can help to remedy these issues. Under that, you'll see ways to actually measure success, which we don't talk about often in these cases. So after wonderful attorneys have done their job and we get new programs in place, who's measuring the success of those things? And are the metrics that we have in place equitable in their nature to measure the impact that we want to see? So not just did we increase jobs, but were those jobs in the zip codes that are immediately adjacent to the park? Are those jobs to residents that are Black or Latinx? Are those jobs to people that fit in the traditional average median income of the neighborhood? Measuring against our current conditions and making sure that the neighborhood is growing with the investment and not being left behind. Okay, and on the bottom are potential partners for collaboration. So I'll switch to the next one just so you have an example of what that looks like. And these were additional solutions. So this project was completed in 6 different categories. So we had housing, environment, health and wellness, we had leadership and history. There are a number of different areas that you can tackle these points from. Okay, again, that gets back to the holistic nature. It's not just one thing that happens at a time, so you're not just struggling with housing. Even as we saw in the previous presentation, it's always and. So housing and transportation, environment and access to jobs and quality education. It's always an and so this report was a holistic way to address those issues. Okay, and then the current one that we're working on is the West Dallas Community Vision Plan. And this is the first project that we've done that has been led by residents, which I'm really excited about. And so it's still in process, so I won't have a ton to share, because I actually have to meet with our steering committee in a week and share updates with them first. But this process was looking at, after everything that had happened in West Dallas, after all of the zoning that's taken place, all the industrial activity that continues to pollute the neighborhood, how do we tackle this again from a different point? So we're looking at creating a policy platform where the community's vision and desires is unified in one document that they can take to their council person, to their state rep and say, these are the things that we want, or use in the city of Dallas's forward Dallas planning process to say, these are the things that we've highlighted that are of importance to our neighborhood. The next portion of that process is actually creating a plan that will implement community informed and approved changes to zoning and how land use can be better created in West Dallas to support the overall health and wealth of the community. Okay, so here I'll just give a quick overview of how this project is outlined. The steering committee has representation from every neighborhood in West Dallas, and that's the entity that's actually leading the process out, that's telling us, as we bring to them our professional expertise, how they like to see engagement or tweaks to engagement, what they've heard from their neighbors as what's the most important in each one of the policy areas that we've identified. They're working in partnership with an advisory committee that has subject matter expertise to partner with the local expertise of residents on the steering committee. There are several other collaborative projects, one of which I mentioned was the City of Dallas Forward Dallas Plan. It's happening in tandem with us, so it makes sense for us to collaborate and share what we're learning while they're in the process of updating their plan, so they're not having to redo work, and that in real time it's being updated by resident feedback. There are a number of other projects that are there. The Fish Trap Lake project that's being redone and considered. There's Downwarders at Risk, we talked with them. GAF has been present at some of the meetings. So really being informed by what's happening in the neighborhood and using that to suggest the policy changes that we'd like to see and to inform the zoning and land use suggestions. Okay. And then I'll leave it open for discussion, but I think we're moving next to James.
So I'm actually going to play a video. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but just to provide some additional context, like I said, I'm James Mcgee. I'm a former banker turned nonprofit guy. And so kind of the history of the Banking Below 30 series is that early 2020, I kind of wondered how many banks are within Dallas County, what were they, doing to serve Southern Dallas. In 2020, there are 105 banks. Actually, as of today, there are 115 banks. We steadily get more banks to come in. But one of the interesting things, I actually contacted a community partner, Child Poverty Action Lab, to map the number of banking branches above Interstate 30 and below Interstate 30. And what we found back then was there are 466 banking branches above, Interstate 30, and below Interstate 30, there were only 66. So kind of fast forward, David Shackner from Channel 8 contacted me because of my banking experience, and he wanted to do a story on PPP lending and the disparities there. I was like, well, that's not really the problem. Let me tell you about the preliminary research of which we've done as for the number of banks and possible redlining. And I kind of looked at three different banks that didn't include Southern Dallas in what we call the assessment area, and that'll be covered in the video. And so, believe it or not, he actually listened and went to go look up all those banks as far as what they were doing, pulled all their, it's called a public evaluation report, and kind of went through those. And three of the banks are going to be mentioned in the video that's going to play. But just the most important thing, what we've done since then, we filed 2 redlining complaints to the Department of HUD. And so 15 additional complaints will be filed as a result of that. So we're actively making progress. And like Dr. Carter mentioned, actually taking action. The news stories are great, they got national attention. But how do we remedy that? How do we prevent that from going on in the future? You can go ahead and play the video.
Interstate 30. So many people drive east, west, north, and south of it, you might not even realize how it carves Dallas in two. I-30 is also the line that largely separates financial opportunity in the north from financial barriers in the south. Why is that? Well, we have found new evidence of practices that exclude Black and Hispanic residents from getting bank loans below I-30.
Petrie says he went to Houston to get financing for his business after 7 local banks and savings and loans turned him down. He sees his problems as typical, wanting to expand, but getting little or no support from financial institutions.
In this community, it's an economic embargo, and we wouldn't have a housing problem, we wouldn't have an unemployment problem, we wouldn't have a police problem.
That was 32 years ago, and today car wholesaler Robert Petrie is still in business at that same location in South Dallas.
The things that you talked about in 88, is anything better? It's all pretty much the same?
I would say worse.
Today, Petrie also owns 132 acres of land, including a large event center called Skyline Ranch. He says all of that comes despite a lack of access to bank loans below I-30.
They feel that, hey, the black community, blacks don't deserve opportunities. So we're gonna deny them now.
But they're not just sitting around like saying that, right, in their boardroom.
Well, there are ways, yeah, because they underestimate what we can do as a people.
Above I-30, there's a high concentration of white people and upper income neighborhoods. South of 30 is mostly black and Hispanic people, with 38% of residents living below the poverty line.
This area over here is the corner of the Dallas North Tollway and Northwest Highway. And there are just banks all over the place. There's a bank over there.
There are 31 bank branches packed into this corner, while in all of southern Dallas, there are just 58 bank branches in total. Above I-30, across Dallas County, there are 474 bank branches. The city has a long history of excluding blacks from bank loans. It's called redlining. Check out this map from 1937, with red lines drawn around the south side communities that we're talking about. For decades, banks openly denied loans here, particularly to black communities, and the government said it was okay. Then in 1977, Congress attempted to remedy the practice of redlining with the Community Reinvestment Act. The CRA encouraged banks to meet the credit needs of the entire community where they operate. Under the CRA, each bank draws an assessment area map, which basically outlines where it does business. And the law says a map must contain entire counties, cities, or towns, and it cannot arbitrarily exclude low or moderate income geographies. But the CRA recognized some banks might not be able to serve an entire community, and in that case, they could use something like a highway to draw a boundary, as long as that new map does not illegally discriminate. So our team asked every bank in Dallas County, 105 of them, to provide us with their assessment area maps, the area where they do business. And what we found is that 20% of the banks in Dallas County draw maps that exclude all or parts of southern Dallas.
I mean, so the opportunity is there for any bank. You want to make a committed effort to be part of this community, be part of the effort. I mean, I think it's here.
James Mcgee was a compliance manager who used to help banks follow the rules of the CRA. Now he advocates for greater reinvestment below I-30 as president of the nonprofit Southern Dallas Progress.
So when they draw those kind of maps, is that discrimination?
I think it's discrimination because you look at the demographic of people and where they're located and you're excluding them. I mean, I think it is discrimination.
Here are some examples of what we found. Dallas Capital Bank has a single branch in Dallas County near the tollway and 635. From this location, Dallas Capital provides services to all of Denton County and half of Collin County, but covers virtually nothing in Dallas County below I-30. Dallas Capital Bank has declined to comment for this story. Benchmark Bank has 3 branches in Preston and Royal, Hillcrest and Lovers Lane, and McKinney Avenue, just 2 miles north of I-30. Benchmark drew a map that extends north into portions of Denton and Collin counties and picks up parts of Dallas's affluent Kessler Park and Bishop Arts neighborhoods in Oak Cliff, but little else below I-30. Benchmark says all areas conform to CRA regulatory requirements. There's also Interbank. Its 2 Dallas County branches are located at 75 and Mockingbird and the tollway at Lovers Lane. From these branches, Interbank drew a map that excludes virtually everything south of I-30. To the south of Dallas County, Interbank also has branches in Ellis County, and one of them is just 2 miles from the Dallas County line. Interbank serves all of Ellis County, Erath, Somerville, Hood, Parker, and Tarrant counties, but only half of Dallas County. Interbank declined multiple requests for comment, but in its most recent bank examination, Regulators said no evidence of discrimination was identified.
Why do you think it looks like that map?
Oh, they made a conscious effort to create it like that. And that's going to be a senior management decision that's, particularly, doing that and okaying it. And it's additionally signed off by the regulators.
Banks with maps that include all of Dallas County make 48% of their loans to whites, 22% to Hispanics, and 7% to blacks. Those numbers don't total 100% because not all borrowers report race data. But by comparison, we found banks that exclude Dallas below I-30 lend 45% to whites, 8% to Hispanics, and 2% to blacks. But what about the bank regulators, the people who grade the banks every few years on how well they serve low-income communities? Well, the regulators give passing grades to banks 98% of the time based on the exams that we reviewed. And James says that's happening because regulators don't scrutinize how the maps are drawn, they just grade the banks on what happens inside the maps.
I mean, it has to be judged harder by the regulator. I mean, if we're in school and every class passes, I mean, I think it's something wrong with the test. And I think outside of that, the banks are going to be hard inclined to possibly, improve their current strategy. I mean, because it's working and they're passing their exams.
3 different government agencies work together to evaluate banks. The Federal Reserve Bank declined to comment for this story, but it's proposing rule changes to modernize regulations because of weaknesses in the Community Reinvestment Act. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, says if our examiners identify a pattern or practice of discrimination at an institution, the case is referred to the Department of Justice for appropriate action. And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, regulates big national banks. The OCC has a new rule requiring that assessment areas be no smaller than a whole county. So what can the regulators do?
Well, I mean, what we're gonna do, we're gonna make them do their jobs. We're gonna force them to do their jobs, and we're gonna force the banks to make loans in our community.
None of what you've just seen surprises Robert Petrie at all. He's been discouraged by banks his entire life, and just this January, he sued one. Petrie claimed because he's black, a loan officer quoted him outrageous terms to make him go away.
See, a lot of the things that's happening that's negative in the black community has been by design. And there are forces that have designed these problems that we face, and that's racism.
I think the time has come to bring to bear the power of nonviolent direct action movement on the basic economic conditions that we face all over the country.
Economic justice is not about charity. It's about opportunity to borrow money, pay it back, and participate in the larger economy. But on the road to opportunity, unlike any other highway in Dallas County, only I-30 seems to get in the way. I'm David Schechter reporting.
Well, that story aired Thanksgiving weekend 2020. October of 2021, the Office of the Currency and Comptroller, which regulates most banks, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which monitors most of the bigger banks, and the Department of Justice announced a redlining initiative to get more aggressive, on banks. We haven't had a redlining Department of Justice case in Dallas yet or ever, but in Houston late last year, they kind of settled one with Cadence Bank, and Cadence Bank is now one of the banks that are acting in Dallas. But I think we're going to do questions after this.
How else, outside of getting our leadership to change the zoning, can we really make a difference to change some of these social determinants of health and the environmental injustice that's happening to our communities?
If you're talking to a council person and every one of their constituents comes, but if a group of 1,000 come, it can get their attention a little bit faster. The other thing outside of this city that I would say, you can try community benefits agreements with people that are coming into your neighborhood. So if there's a new developer coming in and they're trying to get their permitting approved, or they meet with the community to get feedback on their plans, ask during that process, what are you willing to do to help improve current conditions before you come in and are able to reap a benefit. And they may not be able to solve everything, but is there one thing that they can do on your priority list of 10 items that they could check off for you, or put you in partnership with someone that could help make it happen? And then the other thing is being visible. So speaking, coming to events, putting things up on Facebook, social media, Instagram, creating your own content. Like we were just asked about, information that was shared here, having somewhere where people can go and revisit that and see it again and have access to it so that they can easily share it as well.
the funding is there for it. You know? And if the banks are not helping, the banks ought to be helping, right? Instead of just focusing on this one aspect of, this is the only housing you get, you know? And it's all low income, give the communities a real range, including home ownership opportunities. That's a very specific and measurable impact. You know, and that's certainly one thing. It has other effects. You know, it improves the property values, etc. I mean, and it's not just zoning. Let's go back for a minute on that. You got to get rid of this shit too. Okay. All right. I mean, you gotta, when you zone it out, it's gotta go. Just like GAO, it's gotta go. Okay. I mean, it's just, you know, changing the name of the line you drew around it isn't enough. We didn't make that clear. There's another stage of the process, but it's a good point.
I would say that, sorry, another ask of the city would be to say to the city has its own banks, right? City, and another one of the series in the banking below 30 was the banking institutions that do business with the city, with the county, et cetera. Go to the city as asked, as I agree, definitely putting it in writing and saying, your financial institution is not helping in our community. You're doing business with this institution. You, city, can go to the bank and you can provide, you can tell that bank, we're not going to do business with you anymore unless you help our residents, our constituents. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think from a financing standpoint, they mentioned the low-income housing tax credit. Some banks somewhere are financing those deals, and I think, and it could be somebody a bank in which y'all currently bank with. One of the things we're doing to make it more transparent to the community, we're building a lending database. Therefore, whatever bank you bank with, there are 400 different companies that lend within Dallas County, but where do they lend, who do they lend to? Therefore, when you're going to go talking to them and asking them what you're doing in your community, you can point to the database and say, hey, well, you didn't lend to any, Hispanics or African Americans. I mean, so that empowers you. If they don't want to change it, take your money out that bank. I mean, you kind of see from the bigger scale, Wells Fargo, they lost millions of dollars just as a result of their scandal. I mean, that has an impact little by little on the banks.
And then we come up with something else. Okay. I guess we can quit.
I would like to address the panel. I know that you all are talking about housing, but my perspective, what I'm looking at is how Dallas Area Rapid Transit has changed their system and how they are limiting people's access around the city. I think it's very discriminatory. Have y'all done any research on it? Because they have stopped the buses from going into the neighborhoods. And they're having a system called Door on Demand, where you have to call and make a reservation, and the little van comes and picks you up at your house. It works from 5:30 to 8 o'clock at night. Some people don't get off of work until 11 o'clock at night. So that leaves them where they have to pay for Uber to get home, or they have to walk home long distances from the rail station. And I want to know if you all have seen any discriminatory practices in this area.
West Dallas lost some access in the way the routes were redrawn. And so that's one of the things that we're talking to residents about to understand what the challenges are that they're facing. How should that be included in their policy platform if they deem, that that's necessary? And one of the things that I would say, for you as you're kind of walking through this, I don't work for DART, I don't have, any skin in the game, but I would keep a record of what's changed, or what routes you see that limit your access now versus what you've had before, and give them feedback on that, and make that clear. I don't know where exactly you live, but talk to your council person as well. Let them know that the changes, well, if they're good, bad in different places, let them know what's happening, but also share your experience so there's something concrete. You've heard us talk in different ways about numbers or having data, getting comments from community members. You need to have something that can show evidence of what you're talking against. So you can say on Mondays or Monday through Friday, we don't have access after, just like you said, after 8 o'clock. But the majority of people in our residence don't get off until 11. So the change here, while it may work in a different place, didn't work well for us. And having something that they can look to adjust and make changes that better suit the community.
Oh, that dartboard knows me.
One thing, see, DART is federally funded. Absent federal funds, DART goes away. Okay, as a federal recipient of federal funding, they have the obligation to make known what the discriminatory effects are going to be of their routing decisions and their other service decisions. They have that. Okay? And the feds are supposed to look at that every time they renew their grant. Okay? It's not up to you to put that stuff together. DART has it. They're supposed to look at every time they make a change. They're supposed to look and see, is that going to have discriminatory effect? They got burned once really badly back in the 80s because they did this, right? I mean, right there now. But that's the law. They've got to have it. They may not. If they don't, then they're wrong. I mean, I would suggest that, legal aid maybe could start on that with you. I mean, or somebody like that. But that's, I mean, it doesn't mean you're going to sue. It just means they're supposed to be knowing this stuff. And they're supposed to, say, yes, we know it's going to have this discriminatory effect, but we're doing this to solve it.
Thank you.
We're talking about a lot of like self-determination and some ideas that really excite me, and I'm curious if in your research and asking community members what they want, if you've looked into ideas of like land trusts or credit unions where the people in the community have direct say over what happens to land as opposed to asking development to come into the community, and like what you've discovered of what people want in those patterns.
The first time I'll say community-driven growth, where we were in West Dallas, the Forest District, which is a part of South Dallas, I was named that for a project, and then West Dallas Census Tract 205. And so at the time, this was 2018, 2019, the city did not have a program in place, but that was one of the suggestions that came out of that process. Heather Way from Austin came up, did a training, informational session with everyone in the group to talk through some of the logistics of what that looks like. And in I want to say end of 2020, beginning of 2021, the city actually approved community land trust within the boundaries of the city. The program is still in process of being created of how you would do that, but part of the coalitions and communities are still kind of moving those ideas forward. It's come up again in West Dallas and continuing conversations there. Some of the feedback that we've got from community members, some of it is how do we manage it? What's required legally, like what will we have to do or need to do? And then the other thing is like over years, how do we maintain and make sure the intent now is still the intent 50 years from now? And so working through that and talking about real implementation, one of the beautiful things about cooperative ownership, whether that's a land trust, we talked about it before, like a grocery store, is that it is an affordability measure for housing. It needs to be partnered with wealth creation, so it's not a solution in it by itself. It addresses one of the many housing issues in Dallas, but it helps to maintain affordable land, affordable properties within that neighborhood. But like you heard in some of the other conversations, it needs to be partnered with ownership. That's how communities really can determine their future, because no one can move them out. The other part that I would say is that it can also create jobs. So if you have community members that are managing it, that are taking, if it's a land trust, but keeping up with property records, tax assessment, all of those things, it could be an income to those residents. So there are a number of benefits, but it's the logistics that are still being ironed out at the time.
But there's also some credibility problems. There was a community land trust at 10th Street Historic District. It was put together by Jack Matthews. And when he incorporated it that the goal was to, at no cost to the city, to exclude the low-income people from the area and bring about the revitalization of the area. So it's, you,
It has some
you really, I mean, there's Dallas puts an edge to everything, okay? And so as good as it could be in the abstract, right? I mean, watching these things is, I mean, it's gotta be policed, it's gotta be monitored, it's gotta be enforced, or else you'd have Jack Matthews on the 10th Street Historic District, do a community land trust.
Like Dr. Carter said, you have to have the legal implications worked out. Protect the risk.
Yeah, and that discussion did come up. It's one of the neighborhoods, the bottom is in Oak Cliff. And so when you're talking about that with residents who have that recent history, first you have to get the idea across, and then with the trust that you build either through your process or lending the reputation of the community organizations that you work with, we don't ever go into a community and say, we are the answer for you. We work with people who are already there, who have relationships, and we come in as a resource partner to help them move forward towards their goal. And so those are things that are being worked out and did come up in conversation. And that's one of the reasons why figuring out how to make it work for residents that are there and maintaining the spirit of what it's supposed to be, community ownership, community determination moving forward of what the neighborhood looks like, who gets to stay, and having ownership of that, that's still in process.
And then Austin Habitat, instead of doing community land trust, what they did is deed restrictions. I mean, just to keep the affordability, particularly with that problem, I mean, with that house. And from an administrative standpoint, that was a lot easier for them than creating a community land trust and people to particularly, run that. And then people from real world sense, people have always been told for years, buy land, buy land. And with the community land trust, like, oh crap, you're taking my land. I mean, so that's been problematic. And then the reference, I guess, for your question on credit unions. So the number of credit unions up north are the same thing as far as banks. But what I did find interesting, city employees credit unions, they do very well as far as lending to Hispanic and African Americans. I mean, but I haven't looked at the remaining credit unions, but most of them are small and they don't do a lot of lending. They do more personal loans and car loans.
Does that come under the Community Reinvestment Act, credit unions?
No, at this time, the credit unions are not subject to the Community Reinvestment Act. There have been some talk to include them because now you have credit unions buying banks, which is weird.
I have a question. There's been some discussion in earlier sessions about gentrification by property taxes. And so as you're looking at reinvestment, as you're looking at removing industrial polluters from some of these areas, what consideration do you give to the potential for increasing property values and pricing people out of their homes and neighborhoods?
The city has the power to say, we're not going to let increased property values drive you out of your home. And if you want to sell and get the value, that's one thing. But we're not going to let that happen. Okay? The city can do that. And the city in places like West Dallas needs to do that. And in places where there is a city effort that is going to raise property values and property taxes, the city needs to pay attention to it. They know that's a problem. The city is not, they know it's a problem. They know it can happen. In many cases, they're counting on it happening. That's what they want. You look at the east end of West Dallas, right? That's.
It's not the only one levying property taxes, right? So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you bring the county, the ISD, the city together to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, somebody has to start. One, the city can do it on its own. Okay, it doesn't need the others to take care of its own taxes, right? There's a county commissioner here that could answer the question about how you would get the county involved in it. And so she laughed. Oh, okay, got it. There you go. And, but yeah, it's a huge problem, right? And it's a way of robbing people, you know, out of the back. All these years, you hang on to it. You go through all this stuff. Your property values stay down, they stay down, they stay down. Something happens, it goes up. And now you leave because some guy comes in and offers you $10,000 more, you know, so you can pay your taxes or whatever. No, yeah, and the city knows. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm done.
Well, I'll give you an opportunity to go again. I live in college town. I live in the old neighborhoods, and you know, I live in a 1920 cottage bungalow. My property taxes are going up because of the amount of landlords and people who can flip houses. And I have wondered, and I have a background in city planning, I've wondered if there was a legal mechanism to have a two-tier tax system, one for people who live in their properties for 5 years or 10 years, and the other who actually have what are quote residential property, but they're really commercial properties. They're using them for a commercial transaction. So could we have two tiers of property valuation for those? One, it's being treated as a commercial basis. One, which folks on fixed incomes or young folks on fixed incomes are trying to own.
That's already built in. Because one, you can determine property values on income. You don't have to do comparable sales. And you can figure property values on comparable sales in the same neighborhood. You don't go outside your neighborhood and find higher property values. The landlord, you say, show me your rent rolls. I think this place, you're taking in enough money that your property value should be higher than by comparable sales.
But within my neighborhood, we have rental properties next to.
I know, but they just charge, they don't assess the rental property by comparing by their comparable property. They assess rental by how much money are they making. That's already a legitimate way of setting property values by the appraisal district. I mean, you would want to start and see if that would work.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
One more question. So we've had a lot of conversations about actual housing, but what we haven't talked about is another element that affects housing, which is amenities around the houses. So it's one thing to have a nice little community, but then you have to travel 10 miles to go to the grocery store or go to the doctor, or there's not a gas station within 15 miles of where you live. We have other issues. So how do we have a two-pronged approach where we are tackling the housing, but also developing the amenities that are going to be needed to support those who live in the house?
So I'll answer that one, but I want to get back to the gentrification question quickly. There's stabilization and overlay abilities that you can have in planning that can help reduce some of the taxes that are in an area, especially for rapidly gentrifying areas. There could be holds on taxes or a limit put on the amount of increase per year or year over year. Like in one of the neighborhoods we worked with, their taxes increased from $7,500 to $15,000 in a year because of land speculation that was happening due to some development that was coming. And so those are things you talk to the tax assessor, you bring it up, you can always appeal your taxes, and then talk to representatives and the city about other options to help stabilize the area that you live in to kind of protect against rapid increases. Those increases will come, but you want things in place that can help you adjust and stay in the home that you held before everyone else thought this was the place to be. And then the other question for developing the neighborhood around, that's more for me an equitable development question. When you look at things holistically, you don't just want to build that one item because everything else is included. So when you're looking at solutions or plans or investments, you include ways to build out those other systems, whether that's in creating the new infrastructure or partnering with other organizations that can come in, relocate, open a new branch, do mobile services as infrastructure is being approved. But those are conversations you want to have when investment is on the table before the plan has been made. So you have to be at those conversations. You have to be at the table And if not invited, pull up your own chair or create your own.
All right, so a huge thank